Hi, folks. This is just a quick explanation of some of the stuff we've just been exploring with relation to economic growth. So the first resource I'm going to show you here is from Gapminder. This is just to give us an idea of what sort of average income countries are generating per head. And you can see here there's a pretty big disparity between the poorest countries' average income, in this case something like Somalia, generating about $630 per person who lives in Somalia per year. And that's after taking into account something called PPP, in other words, the cost of living in Somalia, which we assume might be a little bit lower than in, for example, Switzerland or Norway. If we go up to the top end of the scale, in Qatar, the economy is generating enough income to pay the average person $113,000. So vast disparities in levels of average income between different countries. Now, we will naturally be a bit more interested in countries that are a bit more like our own, closer to home. Let's have a look at the United States. They're generating about $56,000 per person. If we go and look at Germany, widely regarded as the most successful European economy, about 46,000 US dollars per person is being generated. And the United Kingdom, we generate about 40,000 US dollars after taking into account the purchasing power parity per person per year. Now, look, don't take this the wrong way, but that would not be enough to cover the fees at Bradfield College. So this is the average. This is the average income in the UK. Clearly, some people in the UK are going to be earning an income that puts them much closer to the average in a country like India or even a country like Indonesia. And other people in the UK are going to be making money that puts them well in excess of what the average Qatari earns. Now, if we look at some of the poorest countries, we see there is a slight tendency for the sub-Saharan African countries to be down at the bottom of the list. And the Congo is a country we're going to be particularly interested in here in this set of lessons. About $800 per person per year currently generated in the Congo. Very little, really, especially considering the vast natural resources they have. The question is, how rapidly do we think the Congo could potentially catch up, maybe not necessarily with Germany, the United Kingdom, or the Western European economies, but maybe could the Congo be so lucky as to catch up with, for example, Nigeria and get itself up to $5,000 per person per year, or another African neighbor like South Africa, or Egypt perhaps, North Africa there, or Algeria, something that would generate around about $10,000 per year, $11,000, $12,000, the type of scenario where you're imagining the average household earning maybe about $1,000 per month. So obviously, if you're really poor and you want to catch up with a really rich country, you're going to have a GDP growth rate that's really high. Every year, you're going to be adding lots and lots and lots to your GDP. So this is a good website. It's called tradingeconomics.com, where you'll see a list of the most recent economic growth figures for different countries. And if you click on the GDP year on year button there, it'll organize it and re-rank it, in this case, from the worst performing economy, or if I click it again, from the best performing economy in the last year. Okay, so if you look there, you can see that the best performing economy from a growth perspective last year, according to these statistics, was Bangladesh. So they grew at about 8%. Their circular flow of income increased by about 8.2% last year. That's our best estimate anyway. But sixes are still considered very good. And you quite quickly find yourselves dealing with growth rates of threes and fours. So the first thing to understand is that very, very rarely in economic history do we see countries get up into what we call double-digit growth, in other words, 10% or higher. Realistically, a very strong growth rate would be considered to be 6 or 7% per year, and that's the amount that their GDP is increasing year on year. If I go down the bottom of the list here, you can see that there are some countries that are in the red, countries whose GDP has actually shrunk this year over the last year. Now, Venezuela, the obvious disaster economy shining out there, their economy at the end of this year is basically a quarter less than it was at the start. So it's dropped by 26%. That's what we call economic disaster. But China falling by 6.8%, Hong Kong 2.9%, Argentina 1.1%. Any negative growth is pretty bad, and any growth that's flatline is not really what a country is looking for. But remember that high growth rates are going to be more important if you're starting from a really low position, right? If you've got a lot of catch up to do. So it's not the end of the world if Germany's economy only grows at 0.4%, but if the Congo's economy grows at 0.4%, it's going to take it an absolute age to catch up with the advanced economies. So to wrap up, just remember that economic growth is basically saying how quickly is the amount of money that's going around and round and round this circular flow, how quickly is that increasing in an economy? It's really, really important if your country is really, really poor with average incomes of, $500, $600, $700, $1,000 a year for a household. It's really important that your economy grows at a pretty rapid rate and doesn't have any negative growth if you're going to have any chance of catching up with even some of the middle income countries in the world. If your economy is really advanced and you already have very high standards of living, actually you might not be too worried about economic growth, and that's something we're really looking at now. We're trying to focus more on what actually improves our living standards moving forwards. And a lot of that, I'm afraid, has got to do with inequality, because of course having high growth rates doesn't really help improve living standards if all the benefits of that growth is going to the top 1%. And what does the other 99% do? It's worth pointing out, guys, that these are not exact figures. They're often based on estimates. It's actually very hard to measure GDP in a comparable way across countries, particularly across countries with very different characteristics and different stages of development. And of course, I should say that all those growth figures are pre the global pandemic that we're experiencing at the moment, which will almost certainly force very negative growth rates onto many economies as their economies essentially shut down, and this flow of income stalls as households are unable to go and work in firms, unable to interact with firms in markets. Firms are unable to supply their goods and services. In fact, the only one area that's functioning in the economy at the moment is over here at the top right, the government, who are doing a lot of government spending to try and stimulate this circular flow of income. But even with that, it seems very likely that the growth rates next year are going to be very, very different to what we are seeing in that data there. Anyway, that's our little update on economic growth.